Arcturians, are they changing human consciousness? There is something strange about childhood. Before we learn what the world is supposed to be, before we are taught what is possible and what is impossible, children ask questions that adults stopped asking a long time ago. They look at the stars and wonder where we came from. They imagine worlds that do not exist. They ask questions that sometimes leave adults completely speechless. And perhaps the strangest part is what happens next. They grow up, they enter school, they learn what is real, they learn what is imaginary, they learn what they're supposed to believe, and what they are supposed to dismiss. Slowly, the questions become quieter, the imagination becomes smaller, and the things that once seemed mysterious begin to feel ordinary. But what if curiosity is not something we're supposed to lose? What if imagination is not simply a stage of childhood? What if intuition is not a weakness, but a part of human consciousness that we have forgotten how to use? For decades, strange stories have appeared around the world. Stories of children describing things they supposedly could not have known. Children claiming to remember other places. Children speaking about invisible friends, or describing experiences that adults simply cannot explain. Most of these stories have ordinary explanations. Memory can be unreliable. Imagination can be incredibly powerful. Children can absorb information without realizing it. And sometimes, a mystery is simply a mystery, but there is another interpretation, one that comes from a very different world. The world of extraterrestrial contact and channeling, according to messages attributed to a mysterious group known as the Arcturian Council. Humanity may be going through a transformation of consciousness, and strangely, their message does not begin with spaceships. It does not begin with an alien invasion. It begins with children. Why? Why would a supposed extraterrestrial intelligence care so much about the minds of human children? What do they believe children possess that adults have gradually lost? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, what if the thing we call imagination is actually something we never fully understood? This is the mystery of the Arcturians, and to understand it, we have to go back to the beginning, the message from the Arcturians. On August 9th, 2026, Arrow of Light published a message attributed to a group calling itself the Arcturian Council. The title was simple, but the idea behind it was much bigger. The message focused on something most people would never associate with extraterrestrial beings: children's knowledge, their curiosity, their intuition, and their unusual way of looking at reality. According to the message, children may perceive the world differently from adults. They ask questions without worrying about whether those questions sound strange. They explore possibilities without immediately rejecting them. They observe things and sometimes seem to notice details that adults overlook. But according to the Arcturian message, something happens as children grow older. Society begins teaching them what they are supposed to think, what is acceptable, what is realistic, what is impossible, and eventually, the natural curiosity they once possessed can become buried beneath rules, expectations, education, and social conditioning. The message suggests that instead of simply giving children answers, we should teach them how to observe, how to question, how to explore, how to remain curious. And this leads to a fascinating possibility. Perhaps the Arcturian message is not really asking us to believe in extraterrestrials. Perhaps it is asking us to look at something we already experience every day: the mysterious nature of human consciousness. Because if children really do see the world differently, what exactly changes when they become adults? And where does that part of the mind go? Who are the Arcturians? To understand the story, we first need to understand who the Arcturians are supposed to be. Arcturus is a real star, one of the brightest stars visible from Earth. But the Arcturians described in modern spiritual and extraterrestrial literature are something very different. According to various channeling traditions, the Arcturians are an advanced extraterrestrial civilization associated with the star Arcturus. They are often described as highly evolved beings, far ahead of humanity in technology, consciousness, and spiritual understanding. But unlike the classic image of extraterrestrials, They are rarely described as conquerors. They are usually portrayed as observers, teachers, guides, and protectors. Some accounts describe them as beings existing in higher dimensions. Others claim that they operate through energy rather than physical technology. And some messages suggest that their primary interest is not Earth itself, but the evolution of human consciousness. According to these beliefs, humanity is approaching a major transformation, not simply technological evolution, but a change in awareness, a change in perception, a change in the way human beings understand themselves and the universe around them. But there is one enormous problem. None of this has been scientifically established. There's currently no verified evidence that an extraterrestrial civilization called the Arcturians exists, or that they are communicating with humanity. The Arcturian story comes primarily from channeling, spiritual teachings, and extraterrestrial belief systems. And that distinction will become extremely important later, because the mystery is fascinating, but the evidence is another story. The human mind as the battlefield. Think about consciousness for a moment. You can look at the same object as another person and experience something completely different. One person sees danger. Another sees opportunity. One person sees a coincidence. Another sees a meaningful pattern. One person looks at the night sky and sees distant points of light. Another looks at the same sky and feels something almost impossible to describe. Our brains constantly interpret the world around us. Memory influences what we notice. Fear influences what we notice. Expectation influences what we notice. And belief can influence what we completely ignore. In other words, we do not simply experience reality. We interpret it. So imagine, for a moment, that an advanced intelligence wanted to influence humanity. Would it really need to control governments? Would it need to build enormous machines? Would it need to land spacecraft in the middle of the city? Perhaps not. Perhaps changing the way human beings perceive reality will be far more powerful. And this is where the Arcturian story becomes particularly interesting, because according to the messages attributed to them, their influence is not necessarily physical. It is described as something much more subtle: energy, awareness, intuition, consciousness, perception. The idea is simple. If you change the way people see reality, you may eventually change the way they live within it. But is that really happening? Or is this simply a spiritual interpretation of something completely human? Why are they interested in children? Now we come back to the strange part. Children. Why children? Imagine a child sitting alone in a room. Suddenly, the child looks toward an empty corner. You ask what they're looking at. They tell you someone is standing there. You look, there's nobody there. The child describes an imaginary friend. You tell them it is only imagination. They ask where the universe came from. You tell them they are too young to understand. They ask why people exist. You give them an answer. Then they ask another question, and another, until eventually they stop asking, not necessarily because they discover the answers, but because they learn that some questions are considered strange. This is one of the central ideas behind the Arcturian message. According to the message, children should be encouraged to observe, question, explore, and remain curious. Their imagination should not automatically be dismissed. Their unusual ideas should not immediately be ridiculed. And their questions should not always be replaced with simple answers, because curiosity may be one of the most important characteristics of intelligence. Every major scientific discovery began with a question. Why does the Earth move? What are the stars? What is matter? What is time? What is consciousness? Why are we here? Human progress begins when someone refuses to stop asking why. What happens when we grow up? But then, something changes. The child becomes a teenager. The teenager becomes an adult. And the world becomes increasingly complicated. Schedules, work, money, responsibilities, technology, social expectations, information, constant stimulation. The mind becomes filled with things that demand attention. And slowly, the imagination that once seemed endless becomes more controlled. The child who once asked, "What if?" begins asking, "What is realistic?" The difference may seem small, but it is enormous, because what if creates possibilities, while what is realistic creates boundaries. Of course, growing up is necessary. Reality matters. Facts matter. Critical thinking matters. We cannot simply believe every thought or every strange experience, but perhaps there is a balance. A human being can be rational without losing curiosity. We can demand evidence without losing wonder. We can question extraordinary claims without becoming completely closed to possibilities. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson hidden inside the Arcturian story. Maybe consciousness does not need to become less rational. Maybe it needs to become more curious. The hidden ability. Some Arcturian messages go even further. They suggest that human beings may possess abilities that modern society does not fully understand. Intuition, deep perception, energy sensitivity, unusual awareness, and even what spiritual traditions call channeling. According to another message attributed to the Arcturian Council, channeling may not be a rare supernatural ability. It is described instead as something closer to a natural state of human consciousness. That is an extraordinary claim, but before accepting it, we need to separate the idea from the evidence. There is currently no scientific proof that humans can communicate telepathically with extraterrestrial civilizations. There is no verified evidence that the Arcturian Council is an actual extraterrestrial intelligence. But there is something we do know. The human brain is extraordinarily complex. It recognizes patterns. It predicts events. It processes enormous amounts of information. Sometimes it makes decisions before we consciously understand why. We call some of these experiences intuition. So when someone suddenly knows something without being able to explain how, what exactly happened? Is it something supernatural? Or did the brain process information outside conscious awareness? In many cases, we simply do not know, and perhaps that uncertainty is where the mystery begins. The idea of 5D consciousness. There's another concept that appears repeatedly in Arcturian and New Age teachings, the fifth dimension, or simply 5D consciousness. But what does that actually mean? In physics, dimensions are mathematical and physical concepts, but in spiritual teachings, the fifth dimension is often described differently. It is presented as a higher state of consciousness, a state associated with greater awareness, less fear, greater intuition, and a stronger sense of connection between living beings. According to these beliefs, humanity is supposedly moving from an old way of consciousness toward a new one, a world where people become more aware of themselves, their emotions, their environment, and their connection with other life. But there is a major problem. There is no scientific evidence demonstrating that humanity is physically moving into a fifth-dimensional reality. So perhaps we should understand the idea differently. Maybe 5D consciousness is not describing another physical location. Maybe it is a metaphor for psychological growth, a metaphor for greater awareness, or simply a spiritual framework for describing experiences that are difficult to explain. And perhaps that makes the concept even more interesting. What if this isn't about aliens? Now we arrive at the most interesting possibility. What if the Arcturian message isn't really about aliens? What if it is about us? Think about the message again. Question, observe, stay curious, trust your ability to explore. Don't automatically reject unusual ideas. Encourage children to think independently. None of these ideas require extraterrestrials. They are deeply human ideas. Maybe the Arcturian story is simply a modern way of expressing something ancient. Human beings have always imagined beings from the sky, gods, angels, celestial teachers, star people, messengers, visitors from the heavens. Perhaps these stories reflect humanity's desire to understand something greater than ourselves. Or perhaps something really happened in the distant past, and we simply don't understand it yet. There is no evidence proving that ancient humans encountered Arcturians, but the question remains fascinating, Because throughout human history, people looked toward the sky and wondered if something was looking back. Can consciousness really change? There is one part of this story that is not controversial at all. Human consciousness can change. We know that learning changes the brain, experience changes the brain, environment changes the brain, technology changes how we think, culture changes how we interpret reality, and the information we consume changes what we pay attention to. A person who grows up in one environment may see the world completely differently from someone who grows up somewhere else. So consciousness is not fixed. It develops, it adapts, it changes. The real question is, how much can it change? And what ultimately determines that change? Education? Technology? Culture? Personal experience? Or something we haven't discovered yet? The Arcturian story proposes an extraordinary answer. It suggests that humanity may be entering a new stage of consciousness, and that advanced intelligences may somehow be assisting that process. Again, there is no scientific evidence confirming this, but as a thought experiment, it raises a fascinating question. If humanity is evolving, what will we become? Maybe humanity is not waiting for an alien civilization to arrive. Maybe the real transformation begins much closer to home, inside the human mind, in the questions we ask, in the things we refuse to dismiss too quickly, in our willingness to explore ideas without immediately accepting them as truth. Maybe the Arcturians are real. Maybe they are not. Maybe these messages are spiritual experiences interpreted through a particular belief system. Or maybe there is something about consciousness that humanity still does not understand. We simply don't know. And perhaps, I don't know, is not the end of the investigation. Maybe it is the beginning, because every great discovery in human history began with someone willing to admit that there was something they did not understand. Look at a child staring into the night sky. They don't know the names of the stars. They don't know how far away they are. They don't know how galaxies are formed. They don't know how enormous the universe really is. But they look anyway, and they wonder, are we alone? Where did we come from? What is out there? And perhaps the most important thing we can learn from that child is not an answer, it is a question. Because maybe humanity does not need to become something completely different. Maybe we simply need to recover something we had before, the ability to wonder, the courage to question, and the humility to admit that reality may be far stranger than we currently understand. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether the Arcturians are watching humanity. Perhaps the greatest mystery is what humanity is becoming. And if consciousness really is evolving, maybe the next great discovery will not be somewhere in deep space. Maybe it will be inside us. This is the crystal mind. We first listen to the story, and then we look behind it to discover what might actually be true.